Good morning everyone, welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is participatory research, and for this discussion we have with us in the studio Dr. Neera Agnimitra, Associate Professor, Department of Social Work, University of Delhi, and I'd like to tell you more about her that she's the Director of Fieldwork and Placements at the Department of Social Work. Additionally, she has taught courses on research methodology. She's the trainer for many NGOs working on diverse themes of capacity building, and it's a pleasure to have you here, ma'am. Welcome.
Thank you, Urvashi. This particular lecture I think is in line with another lecture that I had delivered some time ago, where I spoke about research, and I spoke about research in the context of social work, education and practice. Today I thought that let me just go on to participatory research, which is an offshoot of the research that we undertake in social work. And not only in social work, many other human service professions also rely on participatory research. So that will be my theme. Just to recapitulate a little bit, you see, when we talk about research in social work, we distinguish between pure research and applied research. You see, in the context of social work, it is applied research that is more important, because research is basically to facilitate and to strengthen practice. It has an action orientation to it. It is not only acquisition of knowledge with the perspective of gaining knowledge. Ultimately, that knowledge has to aid, facilitate, strengthen practice of social work, practitioners. So with that in mind, you see, the conventional research that we talked about in the last lecture definitely has a place, but then there is also the multiple limitations of that conventional research, and in response to that, an alternative which is known as participatory research, which has its own paradigm, it has its own methods, its own criteria, principles, etc., is what we rely on more. Now, if I was to give you an essence of the lecture, I think the slide will really give you an overview. Instead of placing it at the end, I thought I will just place it in the beginning. If I can just read, it says, go to the people, talk to them, live with them and love them, start with what they know, build with what they have. When the work is done, when the task is completed, the people will say, we have done it ourselves. Why I thought I'll begin my lecture with this is because, you see, essentially social work, if I was to define it very, very simply, social work is really helping people to help themselves. So we pitch in not as doers, we pitch in as enablers, as facilitators, as catalysts. So the ultimate end result that we are looking at, that we are seeking, is for people to be able to do things themselves, right? For people not to need us. The ultimate situation would be where people do not need us any longer. They become autonomous, they become self-dependent. So, this in essence is the kind of research and the kind of work that we visualize or envisage, and we say that we go to the people, we live with them, we kind of become a part of them. And where do we build, where do we start from? We start from what they have, right? And then we enable them to undertake their own work, so that at the end they are capacitated, so that at the end they are able to say, we did it ourselves, because essentially that is the process of change that we are visualizing. And this is also the basic premise of participatory research. Now, why do we want to replace conventional research with participatory research? If you look at conventional research, just take the example of, let's say, a survey that most of us do, when we begin work. What are the characteristics of a survey? In a survey, who designs the survey? It is the expert. So if I was to undertake a survey, I would be the one who would design the survey. I would decide what are going to be the objectives, right? What are going to be the goals? What is the resource that I'm going to spend? What is my time frame? Who's going to be my sample? Whether I'll use an interview or an observation. So basically, the expert or the outsider designs the research, right? And here when I talk about research, like I said, I'm interested in research that emanates in action. right, which is the purpose of social work research. So in that sense, this research is based on an outsider perspective. So if I think that, sanitation of a particular slum cluster is an important area where I would want to design an intervention, I would want to go and maybe conduct a small survey to see what is the, what is the status of sanitation within a community. So basically it is again my perspective that has determined the whole design, the format of the research work, right? Even the scope, where I would want to do it, who I would want to include, who I would want to exclude. And by me, it may be an NGO, it may be a funder, it may be a sponsor, it may be a research organization. And a lot of times this research is also vested research, you see, because if, let's say, a particular organization is sponsoring the research, they would be interested in furthering their product or their service or their intervention. So in that sense, the entire responsibility, the thrust, the focus of the research rests with the outsider. Again, what is the status of the respondent? Again, that's very interesting. The respondents, there's a distinct difference between the researcher and the researched upon. So the researched upon or the respondents, they're usually passive entities. We usually undertake a lot of research work in communities, in rural and urban communities, where we just, tell the people that we want to interview them for a particular purpose. So they become passive entities. They are merely objects of research. We have huge schedules, we expect them to devote time, come out from their workspaces and answer. Right? Most of the time we don't even bother to tell them why we are seeking the answers that we are seeking, or what is this data for. So they're merely there to answer, and because there's a distinct hierarchy, you see, between the researcher and the researched upon, a lot of time the researched upon feel a little obligated to answer or to provide the data that we require. So that then becomes the conventional design of you see, the research that is conventional research. Now again, what is the use of this research? Most of the time the use or the advantages are basically, they are reaped by the researcher, in the sense that, you see, if I am the researcher, then what do I get? I may get some knowledge, right? I may publish an article out of it. In case I'm doing a degree course, then probably I use it for my MPhil or my PhD, or I, generally create some kind of a marketability for my service, or I seek a fund from an organization. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the usage is restricted to the sponsors or the academicians or whoever is undertaking the research, and the respondents, they usually fail to derive any advantages or any benefits from such a research purpose. In many instances, we also say that they do not even have a right to access of findings. For example, how many of us go back to the community and say that, look, we had interviewed you, or we had gathered data for this specific purpose. These are our research findings, and this is how you can use your research findings. So this is how we intend to use these research findings for something that will benefit you. So even their basic right to access of findings is denied. They totally remain unaware of the findings. A lot of times you also find that there are a lot of ethical violations because we use the data that we procure from them the way we like. Right? So a lot of times, if we are very casual as researchers, even confidentiality, anonymity, etc., all of these things are also bypassed by us, and it may ultimately harm our respondents, right, or the researched upon. Then we've also found that, you see, this kind of a conventional research, which is again based on an outsider perspective, also generates, even if we are generating certain interventions for the people who are our research subjects or research objects, we ultimately, such kind of research yields exogenous approaches, in the sense that, you see, because these are based on outsider perspectives, we also create an analysis which is based on our perspective, and we then create interventions, action plans, etc., which are based on outsiders, right, and the perspective of the so-called experts that we are. Again, we found through experience, and it is nothing very, everybody knows that the optimal utility of the research of conventional types of research designs is again very limited, because most of the time they are not based on the reality of our respondents, right. So in that sense, because of all of these reasons, it was recognized that the conventional research has a certain level of limitation, and for that we need to move on, or we need to create a paradigm shift in terms of how we look at research from the perspective of action and interventions for our constituencies and our client groups that we work with. So what is this paradigm shift? The first premise of the paradigm shift is that, you see, we are convinced that until and unless the local communities participate in their own development, development is neither felt need based or sustainable. So what we are looking at is people-centered development. If it is people-centered development, then it has to target the felt needs of the population. It has to target the real problems of our constituencies. And we cannot do that sometimes when we use conventional research to assess problems or needs, because again, like I said, the entire paradigm is tilted in our favor. Right from design to implementation to analysis and to interventions coming out in response to such research. The other thing, and which is again very, very important, is what we call the indigenous knowledge system, or very simply stated, it is the traditional wisdom of the community. It is, whether it is rural or urban, every community has some kind of an indigenous knowledge system, which is the alternate model for sustainable development. How do we define it? We say that this indigenous knowledge system is the sum total of all the traditional intergenerational experience and knowledge accumulated by the community. You see, knowledge is of two types. One is explicit knowledge, which may be recorded in secondary sources, you see, which is available for you. You need not really access primary resources to get explicit knowledge. But tacit knowledge is knowledge which you will only get through engaging, you see, with the community or with the groups or with the individuals. And this traditional wisdom or this indigenous knowledge system is context specific. That means it emanates out of the context in which people are placed. It is again time tested, because this is wisdom, and it is transmitted also through the oral tradition. So it is intergenerational. It has been passed on from one generation to the other generation. It has therefore a certain degree of credibility. It is time tested. It has been used, relied upon. It is acceptable to people. You see, people, because a lot of times the indigenous knowledge system is in line with the cultural ethos, the social cultural ethos of the context in which we are working. So these are all the advantages, and a lot of times we find that it is the indigenous knowledge system which needs to be tapped to design the most effective and the most optimal solutions and interventions. You see, I'll give you an instance. You may go to Rajasthan, and we know that there is a water scarcity, and a lot of our interventions are around, you see, conservation of water. Now, when you do that, we as experts with our own scientific knowledge base, we try and create solutions and options which are science driven. And again, I'm not defining science as people science, but science, from a technical perspective. And experience has shown that most of these solutions have been superficial. They have not really worked. And you only have to go to the forts in Rajasthan to see what the traditional, you see, water conservation structures were, how effective they were. I mean, if you go to some of these forts, you will find that there are baulis which still have water even in June, and it was ancient technology which has kind of given rise to these kind of structures, which probably even the experts and the scientists of today cannot create. So, and ultimately, you see, for example, I worked with an organization called Tarun Bharat Sangh, and they revived, the traditional water harvesting structures called johars. These are nothing but earthen dams, and very, very traditional. And in fact, in Alwar, there was a huge revival of the johars, which led to the entire water scarcity problem being overcome, and this entire district was transformed because Tarun Bharat Sangh as a group revived, this technology or this kind of indigenous knowledge which had died out. right? So you don't need any kind of scientific resource intensive technology to create water or to harvest water. All you need to do is look at the traditional indigenous system. So again, this is the paradigm shift that, you know, you need to give proper credence to indigenous knowledge systems that exist, and they're already there, you know, and they're there with the community. The community will be very quick to also, you know, adopt them. Again, what other factors are there? One has to understand that, you know, when you look at development, and here I'm talking of development in terms of the options that we create for people, there are multiple stakeholders, right? And what is development from the perspective of the stakeholders is more important than what is our perspective of development. A lot of times, like I said, the conventional type of needs assessment would not take into perspective, would not take into cognizance the other perspectives. You see, the multiple perspectives of the multiple stakeholders who have to partner within the process of development. Again, the alternate worldview of stakeholders, I've just talked about that. You know, for example, I may go to the community and I may consider sanitation as the biggest need of the community, whereas it is because people have learned to live with open drains. I'm not saying that their health is not impacted, but then that is not the felt need of the community. The felt need of the community may be scarcity of food, or it may be something else. So again, the alternate worldview of stakeholders is a very important element which needs to be kept in the center, at center stage. Again, who owns the development? How sustainable is the process? This is very, very important. You see, again, in terms of the ownership of the intervention or the ownership of development. A lot of times when we design action and interventions, they are in a project mode, project driven mode, where we go, or the funding organization goes, or a social work team goes, or an organization goes, and we implement a project. What is the role of the community? The community is merely a beneficiary. So the community comes, takes benefit of, let's say, the literacy program that we have, or the income generation program that we have. Once our funds are exhausted, once the project gets over, is wound up, then ultimately the process just stops there. So that means that this process of change which was unleashed by any project comes to an end. You know, the momentum just stops. Which means that because the community is not owning the project, the ownership does not rest with the community, the ownership rests with the external agency. What happens is there is no stake for the community, and because there is no stake, the process stops and it is unsustainable, right? So unless there is sustainability to any intervention, you know, there is no use. So for that to happen, the ownership of the entire endeavor has to rest with the community. One very important thing again that we negate or neglect when we undertake interventions or there's a design, you know, when we work with communities for their development, is that we sometimes do not even recognize that, you know, there are multiple groupings which exist within the community, you know, who are vulnerable, who are excluded from conventional mainstream development. And when we go and, let's say, assess the needs of the people of the community, we usually go to groups which have a presence, have a visible presence, right? And we look at their perspectives, we understand, you know, what are their views, what is their idea of community need or problems, etc. And we do not look at other groups which are there, but probably their visibility is not there, their presence is not recognized. Right? So this type of a methodology of research and action, which I'm going to just explain a little later, you know, this is based on the premise that all of these groups count. Their reality is significant, their discourses are important, their perspectives are important, their voices have to be heard. So this is again a major reason why this kind of a paradigm shift from the conventional type of approaches to the participatory research approaches was called upon. Now, where is this kind of a paradigm shift taking place? Of course, this kind of a paradigm shift is taking place in the civil society. It is also discernible in state institutions. It is very discernible in donor agencies, which are now focusing more and more on community participation as being a basic parameter of even funding programs. It is figuring in program and project management driven institutions. It is also being recognized by research bodies and technology development institutions, etc. But if I may be permitted to say that, you see, we still find that it has more of an acceptance and conviction within the civil society. The state institutions are still driven more by conventional type of approaches to development, to research, etc. But increasingly this type of a paradigm shift is being accepted, propagated, advocated by civil society, even by academic institutions. So with that in mind, let's come to a method called participatory rural appraisal, which has in fact which is how this kind of a paradigm shift has been kind of encapsulated in this method of participatory rural appraisal. It is one of the very popular and very effective approaches to gather information in rural areas, because it has that term rural areas, rural, in its formulative stages, it was used more in the rural areas. That is why it is called participatory rural appraisal. It focuses on the participation of the community for whom the action plan is being developed. This particular approach was developed in the early 1990s, and again, like I said, that this captured that paradigm shift from the top down to the bottom up approach. It laid emphasis on decentralized development. That means from expert driven, central kind of an understanding of development to a decentralized development which has a bottoms up approach. Although originally it was developed for use in the rural areas, participatory rural appraisal was also, it has also been employed very, very successfully in the urban context. It is it marks a shift from the very extractive kind of conventional research or surveys, using questionnaires and schedules, etc., to a module, to an approach which is based on experience sharing particularly by all the stakeholders who are involved in the development process. That means partnering of the local people. Now, how do we define participatory rural appraisal? Chambers, in fact, in 1992, he was one of the initial founders of PRA, and he defined PRA as an approach. So it is both an approach and it is a method for learning about rural life and rural conditions from, with and by the rural people themselves. It is a label which is given to a growing family of participatory approaches and methods which emphasize local knowledge. I have talked about indigenous knowledge. It uses very, very innovative techniques. It uses group animation, exercises to facilitate information creation, information sharing, information analysis, and it ultimately culminates in participatory action, which is partnered by all the stakeholders within the community. Now, just a little bit on these three terms: participatory, which means primarily the main focus is on participation. People are involved in a bottoms up approach. That means it requires communication within all stakeholders and an attitude and a context which is conducive to furthering people's participation, whether it is in planning or in implementation and monitoring, or it is in evaluation. Appraisal is nothing but the finding out of information about problems, needs, resources, capacities, potential, etc. Rural, like I said, that initially it was more for use in the rural contexts, but again it is also used in urban settings, and it can work with illiterate and literate populations both. If we look at the origin of PRA, then you see it was in the 1970s when we started understanding the multiple lapses and lacunae of the kind of development paradigms that we were following. Right? And for example, the Green Revolution, we found that while the Green Revolution was envisaged to have a trickle down effect, it had a trickle up effect. right? So all of those limitations of development not reaching down to the bottom rungs of the population, not being owned by the people, and all of that led to a larger paradigm shift in terms of how we looked at development. And so this was, you know, this process also started in the 70s because of the unsatisfactory results which were obtained, you know, on account of the conventional methodologies to rural development. The first step was something called an RRA, Rapid Rural Appraisal. This was evolved in the 1970s, and the basic idea was to, you see, very quickly and very rapidly collect, analyze and evaluate information on rural conditions and local knowledge, and this was primarily on agriculture. So the focus was on agricultural development, that we needed very rapid data to look at what is happening, to draw priorities, look at needs and draw up action plans. The broad aim was to use local people, use in the sense to partner with local people, to make them stakeholders in their own process of development. So this was the initial, you see, genesis of the participatory methodology working. It was developed for quick and field-oriented results as a way of organizing people to collect their own information, to analyze their own information, and also to create their own action plans. But RRA was not very effective, primarily on account of the fact that this was a rapid rural appraisal. And because it was rapid, although there was an element of people's participation, it still remained extractive. You know, by extractive I mean that when I go and I want data, then what am I doing? I have a schedule, or I have certain themes on which I would want people to respond. So people would just respond on the themes or the sub-themes that I have. So I'm only extracting information from them, taking that information and doing my own analysis. So although it was the first step, it still remained largely extractive, and it was again the outside researchers who were rapidly observing, writing, analyzing the situation of the rural communities. Then this kind of a shift from extractive to participatory, from a more narrow-based to a broad-based approach happened when we shifted from RRA to PRA. And PRA is the most widely used methodology. It is based on an interactive process of social development, recognized and used all over the world. It is in the present context, you know, we call it participatory learning and action. This many new terminologies you will find. The basic approach is the same, but you know, many organizations have given their own terminology to this approach, which largely remains participatory. So participatory learning and action, because it is not only an assessment of needs, situation of the people, it also has to emanate or culminate into action, and that action also has to be determined by the local people themselves. So PLA is the newer, participatory learning and action is a name which has been promoted during the latter half of the 1990s. Now what is participatory rural appraisal? Participatory rural appraisal, if I was to capture the essence of it, is concerned with the local people's appraisal of their own lives, their own reality, their own livelihood. It is the people themselves who assess their natural, physical, social, human and financial resources in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their resources. It is they who account for the cost, benefit, strength, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. It is they who assess, who analyze, describe, define and decide on the boundary, condition and act. So that means the total, you know, it's a paradigm shift from the researcher to the researched upon, where the researched upon become the primary doers in every sense of the word. So what is the role of the so-called traditional researchers or the experts? We as outsiders to local communities undertake the role of facilitators. We facilitate the process of participation by creating enabling conditions. The opportunities are the local knowledge, local insights, local experience, expertise, local ideas, local participation, and which is often comes with a much lower cost than any conventional research design would. So that means, now what are these are the very you know, these are very important. What is it that, you know, is changing from the conventional to the participatory, from the role that we had earlier to the role that we have now? Teaching to learning. You see, when I'm the teacher or I'm the expert, I have the chalk. I have the stick. There is a table between me and my students, right? Which is also there in the research context, that I am at a superior position as the expert or the researcher, and the people who I interview or who are my researched upon, they are inferior in terms of a hierarchy, right? So I am teaching, I am superior. So my role is now shifting from teaching to learning, right? So when I go to the field and I become a participant in PRA, even though I may be the deemed expert, I am open to learning. So my role is changing from teaching to being an open-minded learner. Right? Again, there's a shift from top down to bottom up, us to them. You know, in the traditional or the conventional paradigm, we are important because we are the ones who are determining. We are the determinants. From us, now it shifts to them. The focus is on them because after all, the participation, the development, the interventions and the action is for them. Them would mean the local people or the community or the groups. Our role changes from leading to enabling and facilitating. So there we were leading the research process, and now we are only enabling them to do their own research, enabling them to do their own analysis, and enabling them also to develop their own plans based on their own research and analysis. The focus shifts from the individual to the team. Right? So the individual researcher was finding primacy in the conventional research paradigm, and now we have a situation where there's a team, and the team comprises of all the stakeholders who will matter in the particular context. We also move from very theoretical approaches, which is what a conventional research methodology would entail, to more practical and field-based approaches. We move from a paradigm which considers or treats people as objects to people as participants, right? We also move from an approach where we are pursuing targets to enabling participatory, so because that means that we are trying to unleash participation even from the phase of assessment. We are moving from narrow approaches to holistic approaches. Again, what is very important is that you see, when I go as a researcher or when I go to the community, I have a very closed mindset. What is this closed mindset? I have my biases, I have my prejudices. I think that people within the community are not equipped. They cannot become good researchers. They do not have the expertise to assess and to identify and to plan and to make decisions, right? I feel, so I go with very closed, stereotypical kind of mindsets. Now with that mindset, I cannot be a part of a participatory approach. So I have to, shift from a closed mindset to a more open mindset. I have to shift from a lecturing mode, a teaching mode, to a listening mode, a learning mode. I have to shift from a command and control mode to a mode which is more conducive to decentralization. Again, so that means I just talked about the mindset. We have to shift from a mindset of we know to a mindset of they know. This is important because you see, they are the ones who know what their needs are, what their reality is, what their context is. They also know about what are the likely solutions which will benefit them the most, right? So from we know in the conventional methodology to they know. From a situation where we thought they did not know to a situation where we should accept that we do not know, right? So that's where we are going from teaching to learning. From a methodology or an approach where we thought they are the problem to an approach where we say that they have a problem or problems. From an approach where we said we have all the solutions, all we need to do is give the solutions to them, we say they also have solutions, and probably their solutions are the better ones, they're the best ones. Right? So what are the features of a PRA? Features of PRA are iterative. Iterative means that we can change. It is not as rigid as a conventional research is. Once you have your proposal drawn up, you can't change. You can't change even sometimes the questions within your schedule. So iterative means that the goals, our objectives, our process can shift. It can become more flexible. Right? So it is learning as you go principle that we rely upon. It is innovative. Again, it has multiple techniques. A lot of innovative ideas have seeped into the participatory research techniques, and it is again based on the knowledge and skills of our stakeholders. It is not based on our knowledge and our skills and competencies. It has to be varied. It has to be based on the skills and the knowledge and the level of competency of our communities. Again, they are interactive because they are premised on sharing. They are informal because they are not as formal. We are not kind of having any kind of schedules that we are administering. They are partly structured, informal, and that is why, you know, they generate a lot of participation at every level. And of course, they are within the community. They don't happen in classrooms or in labs or in organizations. The whole process happens within the community. It takes place largely in the field. The key tenets, of course, of PRA is, of course, that there is participation, there is teamwork, there is an element of flexibility. I'm just trying to give an overview, you know, so each of these sub-themes can become one lecture in themselves. But then what are the principles of PRA? Like I said, offsetting biases. You know, when we go and conduct a research, where would I go? I would go to a very convenient site. Maybe I would interview the people I find at the roadside. Or who would I interview? I would probably think that probably men are the more knowledgeable people who know more. So I may approach the men, I may approach the well-off sections, I may approach the leaders, right? I may not go into the remote pockets of the community. These are the biases which I begin, and that is why my results are also biased. So here I have to totally offset the biases and work without these biases to the extent possible. So I will have to approach women, I will have to approach groups which are not visible, I may have to go to remote areas. Right. So again, it's premised on this, you know, that the biases that I have to consciously offset them. There's again a reversal of learning. There is what we call a triangulation, that we are not only using one method or one chosen method to assess reality. We have the option of combining methods. We can use 2 or more methods to assess and understand and analyze a context or a problem or a situation. Again, accepting diversity is one of the major tenets and the pillars of PRA, that you have to understand that, you know, reality is not single. I mean, there is a diversity of people, there is a diversity which has to be captured, and that can only be captured using participation as the basic approach. Then again, within the participatory approaches, we have multiple ways of cross-checking, right? So we cross-check, we use flexible approaches. There is also something that we called optimizing trade-offs, which is optimal ignorance and appropriate imprecision. That means we don't need to know so much. Sometimes when we do conventional research, you know, we kind of keep exploring and exploring, and we generate huge amounts of raw data which we don't even use when we are designing interventions. So there is an optimal level of knowledge and an optimal level of ignorance that we are comfortable with. We don't even want a lot of precision. So again, there is an appropriate precision and imprecision. No? So this is quite a change from the conventional approaches that we followed, right? Now if we look at, you see, again, some of the prerequisites that we require if we have to engage with participatory research. Number one is, of course, that we have to unlearn ourselves. We have to believe in indigenous knowledge, local resources, expertise of the local people. We have to be patient listeners. We have to be participant observers. We have to be ready to experiment, right? And be flexible and move on and learn as we go along. And of course, it would require adequate preparations at our level, and also preparing the community to partner in the process of participation. What are the steps in participatory planning? The steps in participatory planning, of course, are that number one, we define the objectives. Why is it that we want to undertake some kind of a participatory research, planning and action? Then we select some site, and of course clearances from local administrative persons, etc. is important. A preliminary visit to look at the site and to explore and to get a basic feel of where we are going to be engaging you know, with the people through this participatory approach. A team visit, extended discussion with key persons. Here I am deliberately not using the word leaders, because sometimes when we say community leaders, again there's a bias that a leader would be the pradhan, or the leader would be somebody from, you know, a better socio-economic background. So I'm using the key person. Again, the key is to be defined by us keeping the diversity of the community in mind. Then an agreement to do a PRA, which would entail that all stakeholders have to agree to participate in this process. Sharing responsibilities with the people is very, very important, because that is the basis of participatory work. data collection. Again, I'm going to just very briefly go into the multiple approaches that we use for participatory research. And so we generate a lot of data, which is spatial data, which is temporal data, which is data on institutions, social structures, and then of course followed by data analysis, ranking problems, ranking opportunities, adoption of action plans, implementation and monitoring, and evaluation. These are all the steps, but the paradigm is totally reverse, right, from what we followed in conventional research. Here it is people who lead every step of the way, right. Rapport building during PRA is very, very important. I'm not going to go into the steps, but definitely it takes a lot of time for us to create the base for participatory research, because people have to be convinced, people have to be explained. So there's going to be a great deal of transparency that you have to have, establish credibility, be open and transparent as to what is the whole purpose, treat people as equals, as partners, in fact treat them, give them the superiority that you enjoy as an expert, and you reverse your role to becoming the learner. Now, just if I may very briefly look at the methods. Of course, probably I'll need another lecture to understand all of, because there's a huge plethora of methods that we engage with in PRA. The first and the most important method of participatory research is what we called transact, walk or walk through. Before I go to go through this, I just want to say that most of the methods that we use in participatory research are based on on a level of comfort that we are able to establish with the community, and they should also be comfortable with these methods. They should not find them intimidating. They should also enjoy being a part of them. All the resources that we use are also indigenous resources. So instead of using a paper and a pencil, we may use a wall or a ground and a brick or a coal to write down things or to draw things. Instead of using a calculator or some of the other things that we use, we may just use some seeds and some twigs and some, so the idea is that we take whatever we need as a resource, even to facilitate participatory research, from the local context, so that the ownership, again, that whole ownership of the whole exercise rests with the community. So instead of creating or using exogenous external resources, everything is also indigenous, right. So again, in terms of the transact walk, what is this transact walk? Transact walk is nothing but we walk through the whole community, through the by-lanes and the lanes along with the people. We try and understand the site and the topography of the community. It kind of gives us, or gives the community, a baseline that this is what exists before the intervention happens. So when you take a walk, and you're not walking alone, you're walking with all the groups of people. So you would have men and women and children. It also becomes a little celebration. So walking through, and number one, because people are walking as a group, there's a lot of rapport building, there's a lot of communication which happens, there's a lot of divides which get bridged. There's a lot of on-site data collection, right? So you're also looking at how the community is living, how the groups are spatially segregated within the community. As you go along, you stop at different places, talk to people, see what are the pockets within the community, where are the resources, where are the taps, where are the toilets, where is the school, who has access to these resources. You also identify sites. You see, for example, what are the problem sites? There may be certain points where garbage is lying, or where water has accumulated, or community toilets which are not cleaned. So all of these, you get a lot of on-site data. And not only you, the entire community. When I say you, it is the entire community. A lot of times the community has also not really seen some of these maybe sites, or they have also not acknowledged them, or they have taken them for granted. And when the whole community goes through a transact walk, then what happens is that collectively there is an acknowledgement of many things. There is also a registering, an assessment, a discussion on many issues which otherwise would escape you, but when you're going for a collective walk with the community, these are the things which you acknowledge, register, discuss, and also take into consideration when you're drawing up your intervention plan. So this is one type of a method that we use very commonly. Urvashi, I may not be able to cover all the methods, but I will just cover some of the important methods, and then probably we could have another lecture on some of the others. Another set of methods, probably I'll finish with these methods and maybe take another lecture, is what we call methods which are based on the visual portrayals. You see, when we look at communities, there are a lot of people who may, because of they are not educated, they may not be able to share a lot of data that is written down, right? So we depend a great deal on depiction, on symbols and diagrams and visual portrayals, because such data can be generated, shared, assessed and discussed, also used for analysis by the larger population of the community. The first, of course, and the most important is what we call a village profile. We are all very familiar with what a village profile is. The only thing is that this kind of a village profile we are not creating through an extractive survey, right? We are creating this village profile through the community coming together. So we set a predetermined date. We encourage people to come together. There is a group deliberation. We encourage people from different age groups, different socio-economic groups, women and men, etc., to come and discuss and prepare a village profile. Of course, the components of the profile would be, location, history, physical information, socio-economic data, what is the infrastructure that is available within the community, what are the different livelihood parameters or dimensions, the wealth ranking, village organizations, basic needs, etc. So we prepare the village profile not through a survey, we prepare the village profile, or the village prepares it, or the community prepares its profile on its own through discussion. Right, and through discussion people participate and they create a profile. A lot of times you don't even need to write it down, it can be depicted through symbols, it can be captured later, through notes taking, but at that time it's important to leave the data with the community. You see, a lot of time when we do our visual portrayals, we leave the visual portrayal on the wall. So whatever we are registering, we will do it, let's say in a Baratghar on the wall, we use a local color, local coal or something to do it, and we leave all the information that we have generated, there. And I've seen, when we do this with the community comes back time and again, and they will again look at the data that they have generated, and they feel very fascinated and very happy that as a community they've been able to, prepare their own profile, and which we leave with them. We don't take it in our notebook, because if we take it with the notebook, the process just culminates there, because then the data becomes ours and they totally kind of disconnect from us. So that is important. Then I will take one more probably a set which is known as participatory community mapping. This is very important. You see, again here the focus is on a spatial analysis of diverse themes. And there's a category of different types of community maps that the community makes for itself. We have categories like we do resource mapping, social mapping, health mapping, literacy mapping, future mapping. What is done is here we enable or facilitate the community to draw its own maps, right? By mapping, the community is again registering all the information as a collective body, as a collective entity. So again we facilitate different groups to come together at a common platform, a common forum, where we encourage the community to draw their own map. This is not a map to scale. It is a very rough sketch of what the community is. It can be drawn on the ground or on the wall. We try and use as much local material as it is possible, so that the community feels that, they are capable. They don't feel intimidated by that whole process. Although we are generating a lot of authentic data, it is done through their resources, through their skills, and at a level at which they are comfortable. right? Now in resource mapping, what we do is we encourage people to, so although one person is drawing the map, many people are assisting the person. People are asked what are the resources that they have within the community. Now number one, you see, the resources, people have a different perspective about resource. Something that I may consider, it's very interesting when we do resource mapping with men. We do resource mapping, of course, with mixed groups, but then we have to understand that in a lot of contexts, women do not speak, or the young people do not speak in front of the older people. So we also do separate, segregated mapping, and it is very, very interesting to find that the resources which are identified by men, men would identify a market or even a liquor shop or a cooperative as a resource. The women will recognize probably at the religious place or the Mahila Mangal Dal office or the school or the primary health center, as a resource. So we do, so resource mapping is again on the ground or on the wall. They will, and they use symbols. For example, they may use a tree or some leaves or some twigs to denote the forest as being a resource for them. Or they may use some kind of a symbol to depict the common water reservoir or a well or a pond that they have, right? So resource mapping, when they contribute, they are all collectively pitching into the whole process, and they are then able to identify all the resources. So what is happening is that number one, they're all sitting together. So there's a lot of social capital that is getting built because people are sharing, and that in itself is, capacitating for the community. Then because there's a lot of cross checking of data, people check each other and say no, the pond is not here or the forest is not here, or we have 4 taps and not 2 taps, and we have 20 toilets and not 15 toilets. So it is a collective generation of knowledge on resources, and once that is depicted, people also acknowledge sometimes they have not been able to understand some of the things or acknowledge some of the things as resources. So in that sense, this is a very, very empowering exercise for the people. We also encourage them to undertake social mapping. For example, social mapping is where we try and identify all the social parameters. So where are the households? What are the different caste groups which are, inhabiting the spatial space of the community? Religious groupings. What about the different resources? For example, where are the religious places located? Do people of all castes have access to the resources? For example, where are the wells or where are the water taps or the hand pumps? How far are they located from groupings based on caste and religion, etc.? So all of that, when people draw themselves, they are also able to understand that when they draw a water tap, and along with that when they depict maybe a habitation of the upper caste community, immediately the entire community is able to understand that, look, the access to water is more to a particular community grouping and not to another community grouping. So you're not only generating data, you're also analyzing data. You're also creating for them an understanding of this whole business of access to resources that we talk about. So it is not only serving the purpose of capturing data, people are also discussing. And a lot of times, again, like I said, they would go back and think that yes, it is making more sense than it was before it was depicted through that kind of a community map. So we have social mapping, we also have health mapping. We can depict all the households, or the community can mark out all the households in a cluster, and then using a symbol, maybe a cross or a tick, we can kind of say, you just ask them a question, how many children have been immunized, or how many children have, go to the Balwadi, or how many children are going to school or not going to school. And just by marking the households, the community gets a very good overview of what is the situation of health, right, or what is the situation of education, and you're doing it in such a simple diagrammatic visual form that everybody is able to participate and everybody pitches in, to also give you information. So it serves multiple purposes of data generation, of analysis, discussion, bridges the social divide because everybody is sitting together and participating. You also are able to validate data, cross-check for errors, etc., because it is a collective exercise. One very interesting form, and then probably I'll end, is what we call dream mapping or future mapping. You see, this also creates a situation where we are able to understand the expectations and aspirations of different groups. For example, you see, I did this exercise with school children. So we invited the school children to come, and we asked the school children to draw an image of the school. They drew an image, where, they showed toilets which were dirty, or they showed a broken blackboard or a broken swing, etc., which was really, the reality of their school for them. Then we asked them that, okay, what is the kind of school that you would want, and draw another image of the school that you would want for yourself. So they did that whole exercise also. So there was what exists, right, in reality, and what is it that they look forward to. So it's like, the present and the future. And then we say, it is also sometimes called a story without a middle, that you have something that exists, something that you want. So how do you build this story? How do you create a situation where you can go from what is to what you want? Then we ask the children that, okay, so for this, from this to this, how do you think this can happen? And then the children gave their own versions. They talked about what were the barriers to, the future not happening, what were the causes, what were the facilitating factors, who would be responsible for creating that better future, what could be their own role in, so for example, the children themselves said that, Didi, probably we could take duty to ensure that the sweeper comes and cleans the toilet, or maybe we can plant more trees, right? So this is very interesting, where they also become, they are the ones who are researching, they are the ones who are assessing, they are the ones who are analyzing and understanding, they are also delineating, identifying roles for themselves, and it leads to an action component coming in. So you're not only researching, you're also planning, you're also probably laying or preparing grounds for action or intervention by people themselves, right? So that's the whole beauty of mapping. So probably I think because of a time constraint, I think I will end here, and maybe I'll take another session to discuss some of the other, because we have a whole lot of very interesting methodologies to use, you see, for participatory research and action.
Right, absolutely, ma'am, and thank you for the very interesting lecture, and we learnt about a very innovative technique called participatory research. And since we are drawn to the close of the lecture, perhaps no questions at all from me, but maybe I could incorporate those in the next lecture.
Sure.
So friends, today we discussed participatory research, and under that we looked at participatory rural appraisal, its features, its principles, and among many things we looked at features or ideas such as visual portrayals and participatory community mapping. And we request ma'am to be here on future occasions so that we could discuss the matter in more detail. So, excuse me. So, thank you so much, ma'am, for being here.
Thank you.
And I also thank all the viewers for being tuned in, and we would also encourage you to ask more questions as we flash our toll-free number next time. Thank you and have a nice day.